Hello, my name's Ellie. I've decided to start this channel just as a hobby really. I absolutely love true crime, so I just want to talk about some true crime cases, mainly solved cases. I really like watching solved cases and finding out about cases like that, and I think there's a lot of mystery videos already out there, and perhaps I will do a few, but I want to focus mainly on solved cases. I also want to do some formal videos, but some informal, just quite chatty videos. And I want to do a lot on like serial killers as well, because I just find it absolutely fascinating. So yeah. Also, I want to do quite a few Welsh cases and cases that haven't been covered as much and talked about as much, because I just think there's so much out there that people don't know, and I just think I find it interesting, so I'm sure other people do as well. So yeah, I'm just going to start straight away. I'm talking about the Man in Black serial killer today, which is Peter Moore. So the story starts with a man called Henry Roberts. Now this is in September of 1995, and Henry Roberts is a man who lives in Anglesey. He's 56 years old and he's a retired railway worker. And he lives on his own. He's lived on his own all his life, but he lived with his mum for quite a long time, just him and his mum. And then when she died, he just lived on his own. So he didn't really have any friends or family around him. He very much kept himself to himself, but he went to the pub every single night to drink. He drank quite a lot. He was known for being a type of man to spend his money in the pub and get drunk every single night, and that was kind of his routine every single day. So people knew him in the pub, like the locals, they knew who he was, but they weren't really friendly with him or anything like that. They just kind of knew that that's who he was, and he did that every single day. So in September 1995, there was about 3 days where the locals hadn't seen him in the pub, and they thought it was a bit strange, they thought it was a bit weird that he wasn't there, because he'd been there every single day since they could remember. And they knew he was a man of a certain age, and they knew that he lived on his own, so they just wanted to go and check on him just to make sure he was all right, because he didn't have anybody else to. So they thought, we'll go and check on him, see how he's doing. So they got to his house, and that's when they saw his body on the floor outside of his doorstep. And he was covered in blood and covered in stab wounds and had his trousers around his knees. So they phoned the police, and it was very clear that there had been a murder, and it wasn't a natural death or anything. And the police didn't really know where to start, because there was absolutely no evidence left at the scene. There was no weapon, there was no clothing, there was nothing. So they didn't even know where to start. They were a bit lost from the get-go, to be honest. And his autopsy showed that he had 47 stab wounds in total, so a lot. And a lot of superficial wounds, so he had a lot like on his arms, on his legs, on his buttocks, like a lot of places where when you would stab, you know that wouldn't kill someone. It was just, this person obviously was prolonging the attack. So it was, a brutal murder. So the police put out a public appeal, because they didn't really know where to start, so they just wanted to see if anybody knew anything, any witnesses or anything like that. And nothing really came from it, other than some people said that they saw a van outside his house a couple of days before the murder. So that's all they had to go off at first. And then 2 months later, in the November of 1995, the body of Keith Randall was found. Keith Randall was 49. He was a traffic manager. He worked on like construction sites, and he would travel around different construction sites, and he would stay on his own in like a caravan on these construction sites. So he had a family and everything, but like with his job, he would move around and he would stay at these caravans, overseeing everything. And one morning, the rest of the construction workers came to work that morning and saw him on the floor outside his caravan, with the gravel all over the place. He'd very clearly been stabbed. There was blood. There was a lot of things out of place. So it looked like there'd been a real struggle. So they called the police. The police identified it as a murder. And then they identified it as Keith Randall. And Keith Randall was known to be the loveliest man. He was very charitable. He helped the elderly. Like, he was just a really, really lovely man. And there certainly wouldn't have been anybody who would want him dead. So police had no clues again. There was no evidence, no weapons, nothing left at the scene. They did another public appeal. and the only thing that came forward was that a van was spotted on the construction site that night. And there wouldn't have been any other vehicles there because Keith Rowland was the only one there, and he didn't have a vehicle there. And they sort of tracked his movements from that night, and he had been to the pub, then he'd got chips, and then he'd gone home. And that was the last that anybody had seen of him. So the police knew at this point. They assumed that these two were linked. They were 2 months apart, only 5 miles away, and they both had vans near the murder scene. So the police didn't publicly announce that they were connected because they didn't want to scare the public that there was a serial killer going around or anything like that, but they knew that they were looking for the same person. And then a month later, on December the 19th, and this was 40 miles away, so quite a distance away from the other two, a body was found on Pensarn Beach. The body of Anthony Davis, or he was known as Tony Davis. And that night actually, Tony in the day had been with his wife and his aunt, and they'd gone to the cemetery to see his aunt's late husband's grave. And they were there, and his aunt actually tripped and fell over when they were there, and she broke her leg. So they took her to hospital, and they looked after her, and then they, took her back home or whatever. And then Tony and his wife returned home. And later on in the evening, the kids had gone to bed. Tony just wanted to go and check on his aunt one more time, just to see if she needed anything before bed or anything like that. He just wanted to go and check in on her one more time. So his wife stayed in the house, and he left to go and see his aunt. And his wife waited up for him. She thought she'd wait for him to get back before she went to bed. And she'd been waiting quite a few hours, and she thought, she didn't want to panic at first. She was like, it's fine. He's obviously checking his auntie. She obviously needs things, whatever. And then it started to creep into the early hours, and she started to get a bit worried. She didn't know, why he wasn't back. She thought it was strange that he hadn't phoned or said anything, and she couldn't get hold of him. So she knew that something wasn't quite right. So she rung around his friends. Most of his friends were sleeping because, like I said, it was early hours of the morning. And then she got hold of his brother, and they decided to go out and look for him. So the wife and the brother went out to search for him, and they couldn't find him. So they contacted the police. And the police began a search of their own, and a few police officers went down to Pensarn Beach, and they spotted Tony's car, and it fitted the exact description that the wife had given them, registration plate and everything, so they knew that he was around that area. So they sort of called the family and the rest of them to say, right, we found his car, he can't be far from Pensarn Beach. So the police were looking on the beach, and that's when they spotted a bundle on the floor, and obviously it was pitch black, it was the middle of the night, it was winter. So they got closer, they turned their torches on, and then they saw the body of Tony, and he was very clearly been stabbed, and he was dead and murdered. And this didn't feel like it fitted the other two because this was just on the beach, it was a random attack, and actually the family don't even know why Tony was on the beach because they thought he was going to his aunt's house and then would have come home. So still to this day, they have no idea why Tony was on that beach. They thought he might have just gone for a walk or whatever, maybe afterwards to clear his head, I don't know. But there's questions about why he was even there. So obviously this is just really tragic. It was obviously a case of the wrong place at the wrong time. But Pensarn Beach had actually been known for attacks. There was a lot of attacks that happened at Pensarn Beach, particularly the men's public toilets. And the men's public toilets was known on Pensarn Beach as a gay meet-up point. A lot of gay men would meet there and hook up in the 90s because coming out was illegal at this point. They weren't allowed to be gay, and a lot of them would discreetly go there. But there was a lot of attacks, and a few were reported to police, and they described the man who had attacked them, and they all fitted the same description. This was a tall man who would wear all black hat, leather jacket, black boots. They nicknamed him the Man in Black. That's where it came from. But the police were convinced that a lot more attacks had been happening, and that people just didn't want to come forward because they didn't want to come out, or they didn't feel comfortable saying that they'd been there or why they were there or whatever. So the police set up an anonymous call line for anyone who had been attacked on Pensarn Beach to come forward, and they wouldn't know who they were, they wouldn't know that they'd come out, anything like that. And they actually got a really interesting call. They had so many, by the way, so many people phoned in, so many people reported these attacks, and they all fitted the description of the Man in Black. But one in particular a man had described meeting the man in black on Pensand Beach, and he invited him back to his house. So the man had gone with him, the man in black, in a van, and gone back to his house. And when he got to his house, he was brutally attacked by the man in black. And he actually managed to escape just about, and he had really, really bad injuries, like possibly life-threatening injuries, but luckily he escaped. And because of this now, he could give a description of the van, the man, and the house. So he sort of drew on a map and gave police directions to where this house was. And this was an amazing lead for police, and they followed it. And they followed it to a place called Darlington House. And they actually recognised the man who lived here. They knew who lived here. It was no more than Peter Moore. So I'm going to tell you a bit about Peter Moore now and who he is. So Peter Moore was born in September of 1946. He was born in Swansea, which is where I'm from. And then him and his parents moved up to North Wales when he was about 10 years old. And they built their own house. And it was the biggest in the area. It was a really, really nice house. They had a bit of money. It was really close to all like the upmarket shops. And Peter was spoiled. His mum thought that she couldn't have kids, so she absolutely worshipped Peter. She called him the miracle child. She adored him. So he always had this special treatment. And Peter kind of had a bit of a complex. His house was bigger than everyone else's. He was spoiled. He thought he was better. He thought he was too good to make friends with the poor kids. And he sort of developed this complex, and he didn't actually have many friends growing up because of this. He thought he was too good for people. So he was kind of a bit isolated and known as a bit odd. And he was described as quite effeminate, a little bit different. So he, was quite different to the other kids, and therefore sort of kept himself to himself and spent a lot of time with his mother. But one thing that Peter loved was film. He adored films, old films, horror films. He had a cine camera, he was one of the only people in the area to have one, and he would constantly film his parents, film himself, doing all kinds of things, and he loved that. And his father, Ernie, really didn't like the way that Peter was. He didn't like that he was effeminate and camp. He assumed he was gay, even though Peter probably didn't even know his own sexuality at this point. So he assumed he was gay, and he wanted a macho son. He wanted a proper boy's boy. So he was a bit domineering towards his son and his wife. He wasn't very affectionate to either of them, and he drank quite a lot and he got quite angry. So him and Peter did not get on very well. He didn't have a strong bond with his father at all. And this only made him closer to his mum. And he was deemed as a mummy's boy completely, and his mum thought he was amazing and idolised him and everything like that. So I guess this all came into account. And then in the late 80s, Peter Moore's father, Ernie, died. And this only made his bond with his mother even stronger and made him even closer to his mum. And during this time, he actually started this community and became part of a film community. And they would all watch films together, and they'd all watch horror films. And he started to develop his love for film even more and everything like that. And during this time, he met a man who owned some local cinemas, and they were like old school, old fashioned type cinemas that used a film and projected and stuff like that. And Peter was obsessed and loved the idea of it. And the man who owned it would say to him, like, oh, the business is dying out. I don't think I'm going to keep it for much longer. I don't think there's much of a market for it. And Peter was so keen to buy these cinemas. He was like, I'll refurbish them, I'll make it into something, I really want to buy it. So he did. He bought the cinemas. He had 4 in total across North Wales, and he did just that. He refurbished them, and they were hugely popular. There'd be like 1,000 people there a week. He'd have snacks there for people. He set up a kids club on a Saturday morning for children to watch films. So he was really becoming popular. But meanwhile, during all of this, he was struggling with sexuality. He knew he was gay at this point, and he couldn't come out. He was too scared to come out. He didn't want to lose his mother's love. He didn't want to be judged. He just did not want to come out. He did not feel comfortable with it. And this kind of made him angry and frustrated. I mean, as it would, like, I sort of understand that. He was, frustrated and angry, but unfortunately, this started to turn quite negative, and he started taking advantage of men, or started, like, slightly attacking them. It would be like, you know, little bits of violence, pushing and shoving different people and whatever. And it was because he was jealous of these men who were openly gay, and he felt like he couldn't be, and he didn't want to. And he knew that he couldn't start relationships or bring men back or anything like that. So he just had this anger within him. And he'd probably seen this anger from his father as well growing up, who was constantly angry with him. So then in 1994, Peter's mother died. And whilst he was absolutely devastated, of course, his mother was the only person he had in his life, and he loved her and she loved him. This now meant he could come out and he could be who he was and who he wanted to be. So this was obviously a complete change for Peter. He was allowed to be out, he could go and meet people, he could bring them back, he could form relationships. But unfortunately, it was just a little bit too late. He had already started abusing men and attacking men, and this was only going to make it worse now that he had more freedom to do so. He had his own house where he could bring people back and assault them. And then on his birthday, he bought himself a knife. And then all through this point was when the Penson attacks started happening, and they happened all the way up until September, when Henry Roberts was then killed. So jumping back in the timeline, so police arrived at the Starlington house, and they knew this man. They knew it was Peter Moore. They knew he was this known man in the community, this local man who owned all these cinemas and was really respected. And the kids called him Uncle Pete because they loved his kids club and stuff. And they knew who he was. So they went out in groups to sort of search for him to see where he was. And they went in groups because they knew that Peter Moore was a dangerous man. And they found his van, and they followed him, and they pulled him over, and they searched his van, and they actually found a knife in his gym bag, and it still had blood on it. So they knew they had the right man, and they arrested him there and then, took him back to the police station. And he went willingly. He didn't put up a fight, he didn't ask any questions, he just went. He knew. So he went with them to the police station. I mean, whilst he was being questioned at the police station, they were searching his house. And they found a ton of evidence linking to all three murders. Because Peter Moore used to take trophies. He would take items from each of his victims as a, celebration for what he'd done, or for some sort of gratification that I don't understand. So they found Tony Davis's coat, the one on the beach. They found Nazi memorabilia from Henry Roberts' house, which is questionable. Moving on. And they found camera footage from that construction site, so he'd obviously been watching the movements of Keith Randall. So they knew, they had all this evidence, they knew that this was their guy, basically. So they confronted Peter with all this evidence, and they said, look, we've got this, we've got that, we know you did it, and he denied everything. He admitted a few attacks on Penson Beach, because obviously they had that evidence as well. He admitted a few of those, but he denied all of the murders. But the police were just frustrated because they knew they had him. Why not just confess? It would just make things a lot easier. So then Peter Moore, he had denied everything. He'd gone back to his cell, and about early hours in the morning, 2-3 o'clock in the morning, he called the police for a meeting on his own time, trying to have control, trying to have power, sits them down, confessed to all three murders and to an additional fourth murder. And the police hadn't even connected to him at this point. So in his own account, he said he confessed to stalking Henry Roberts, the first guy. He would follow him home from the pub quite a few nights in a row. He would sit outside his house. He would check he'd go home alone. He'd check he didn't leave the house again. Check that he was drunk. And then one day he just made his move and he knocked the front door as soon as Henry came home and just stabbed him. And then he admitted that he'd followed Keith home from the pub, saw him get chips, followed him getting chips, and followed him home and knocked the door and attacked him. But he said that Keith Randall actually put up a massive fight, and this actually scared Peter. He thought, I'm not going to be able to complete this murder. And there was a real, struggle between them both and a confrontation, and it was moved all along the gravel, which is why all the gravel was moved and everything, and it was a real scene. But obviously he eventually did kill him, and it was said that Keith Randall was pleading for his life, and he said, why are you doing this to me? And Peter Moore said, because I can. And then he said on Pensarn Beach he saw Tony walking on his own and killed him. He took an opportunity. So which is just so frustrating because Tony Davis wasn't even supposed to be on that beach. He was meant to be at his aunt's house and coming home, and it was just a classic thing of wrong place, wrong time, and that must be so incredibly irritating and frustrating for his family, because if he just hadn't been there then he wouldn't be dead and he'd still be here now. And I just think that is heartbreaking to even get your head around. I mean, of course all 3 murders are completely heartbreaking, but there's something about that one for me that is especially heartbreaking because that's just not the way it should have gone. You know, Peter Moore wasn't looking for Tony Davis, he just saw a man, and that is just heartbreaking and frustrating and evil, I guess. And then yes, he confessed to a 4th murder which police hadn't connected, and he said he met a man called Edward Carthy, in a gay bar and this murder was actually in between the 1st and 2nd murder, so it was in between Henry Roberts and Keith Randall, so it was his 2nd murder. And he said it was like October time, so in the month between them both, and he met this man at the gay bar, Ed Carthy, and they were dancing, they were flirting, and Peter invited him back to his house. So they got in his van and they started driving. It was quite a while away from Peter's house, where this gay bar was. And Edward actually fell asleep in the car. Peter thought, well, instead of me driving all the way home to kill him, to dispose of his body, I'll just pull over to, you know, woods or forest on the side of the road. So he did just that. And he locked all the doors of his car, pulled over and woke up Ed Carthy. And Ed Carthy was a bit startled, a bit confused, tried to get out of the van, but obviously he couldn't because it was locked. And then Peter got out a knife and started playing games with him, telling him he was going to kill him. And obviously this was horrifically scary for Edward Carthy, and he tried to get out and he couldn't. But then Peter got round to his side, dragged him out of the car and killed him and buried him in a shallow grave. Again, the same as some of the other victims, he didn't stab him straight away in a fatal place like the head or the chest or the heart. He'd stabbed his arms, stabbed his legs, which is just horrendous. So anyway, we now had a confession of Peter Moore. He'd confessed to 4 murders. They had the evidence at his house. You know, they knew that this was he was going to go down, the trial was going to run smoothly. And Peter really loved the control. Peter loved the media attention he was getting. Every time that something was posted about him in the newspaper, he would like save the articles, or like if they got something wrong in the newspaper, he would send in a letter to the newspaper to like correct them. And if they used the same photo a couple of times, he would send them updated photos. Like, it was really sick. He was just absolutely loving this attention, which is just disgusting. And then when he was like in the police cars and between the trial and stuff, he would like have his hands handcuffed, and he would like hold them up for photos, like proud of what he'd done, obviously showing absolutely no remorse. He'd pull faces for the camera, he'd pull like scary faces, or he'd be like smiling, like absolutely disgusting. Evil man. And then just days before his trial, he called a meeting with the police, trying to get some control, doing it on his own terms. And he retracted all of his confessions, all 4 confessions. He said, it wasn't me, I didn't do it, nothing to do with me. It was actually my accomplice, Jason. And police had to look into it because, you know, he's accused someone else. There could be a potential serial killer out on the loose that they now haven't caught. So they had to look into it. They didn't believe him, but they had to look into it. They had to. And they realised that there was no one called Jason that even knew Peter, let alone was linked to any of these murders. And they found out he was basing this off a fictional character from the horror film Friday the 13th. So he was just like clutching at straws to try and, like, I don't know, prolong his trial or just try to get a bit more control or whatever. But they ruled it out, and then the trial, it ran smoothly, and he was found guilty and he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. And the judge said that he was just a danger to society and that he was evil and he will never ever walk free, which is exactly the result everyone was hoping for, and I'm sure not the result that Peter was hoping for. And he went to Wakefield prison, and yeah, he will die in prison. He is still alive today and he will die in prison because that is what he deserves. And actually, a fun fact, whilst he was in prison, he befriended a man called Harold Shipman. And if you don't know who Harold Shipman is, was a serial killer. He was a doctor and he used to kill his patients. He killed so many of his patients, and with morphine, it was just, yeah. And they befriended each other. I guess they thought the same, and the same evil mentality. Perhaps I'll do a video on Harold Shipman when I do some of my serial killer videos. But yeah, that completes the case of Peter Moore, the Man in Black, one of Wales's most notorious serial killers. And I mean, yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. And yeah, I'll see you at my next video. Thank you very much.